Hey, Brendan.
Happy Wednesday.
Yeah. Give me 1 second. I'm just gonna finish getting my coffee here.
No worries. Oh man, we're getting the gang all back together again.
Hello. Good morning.
Morning, Parth. Good to see it. The flight with the entire team made it back in one piece, apparently.
Yeah. It was a long flight, though. I mean, I think yours was probably longer because you had a layover.
I had
Or
two
two layovers.
layovers.
Oh God.
The one in the middle, Winnipeg, wasn't bad at all because I was looking at it saying, okay, where do I got to go from, like, what gate am I landing at to what gate do I have to go to? And I was looking up in the little app and it was like gate 11 to gate 11. I'm like, oh, same plane. So I just got off real quick, used the bathroom, grabbed a sandwich, and got right back in line and get back on again. So that wasn't bad at all. And then customs in Toronto again.
Yeah.
So getting used to doing all my customs check there because they do it. The US side is in the Toronto airport.
Yeah, I think they did all the passport check and everything in the Vancouver when they flew directly.
Nice. So no customs when you got to New Jersey.
No, nothing. You
Nice.
just walk out the door. You're done.
Easy.
Yeah.
Canadians make it so simple. So do we have any agenda for today? Sonny, welcome to the gang here.
Still nothing. I'd already told some of the folks yesterday, like I'm pretty much calling this the last meeting. I'm gonna like unless somebody kind of comes in and picks it up, I don't think this is a good use of everybody's time. We have the same sort of 3 conversations every 2 weeks. So some interesting stuff from Open Source Summit turns out once again, a bunch of people are looking at Fresca, but nobody is really talking about it, contributing to it, even discussing their use cases. A lot of folks sound like they who are doing that are at large enterprises. They're not at liberty to actually talk about Fresca, which is a disappointment. But I just want to, I'm not going to call out names, but there's a lot of folks who are saying we should still work on Fresca, but they themselves are not contributing time or resources to Fresca. Yeah, I'm willing to call it a wash and move on to other things.
I'm also comfortable just saying async, we're doing pretty decent on pull request issues, stuff like that.
Same. I mean, like I'm not gonna say, hey, let's all abandon it. But I don't think even the every other week sort of meeting. Some folks are asking for, hey, has Fresca thought about going in a different direction? And I think we're more than comfortable with going in a different direction, but we need folks to actually show up and help steer what that direction might be. But yeah, at least until then, at least until it's a higher priority for some of the other folks or whatever, I think we should just cancel this meeting at least and handle async stuff.
So before we make that jump, Sonny, I see you showed up. What direction would you like to see us take this, or are you just attending to see where we're at?
Well, I'm part of Kasari, right?
Okay.
So I've taken the side already.
Well, no, I mean, we still want to hear your personal opinion. I know you've spoken to me a few times about And I think we're all on the same page that people are not moving off their CI systems. And to be clear, I think that like folks who have used like I don't know if they're allowed to disclose, but like there was a company at Open Source Summit that had said, yeah, we've been looking at using Fresca. Not Fresca itself, but we looked at Fresca and we looked at the architecture and we tried to follow the architecture for what we were building internally. And so like because we couldn't, we had all this legacy stuff, so we couldn't immediately shift over to Spiffy Spire and all these other things, but we still had a lot of other stuff that was able to help us hit those same sort of boxes. And that was super useful. So that was interesting. The other thing, I know you and I had sort of talked about this as well, and a few other folks, is like, does it make more sense for, not talking about Fresca necessarily right now, but talking just more broadly, does it make sense for folks, like, if there was something like Fresca, does it make more sense for it to be something like a secure builder, whatever that may be, that secure builder can plug into your Tectons, your Jenkins, your whatevers, and it being sort of a secure build step that itself takes care of the salsa and everything else. And then we say, hey, look, we're not here to secure CI, we're here to secure specifically the build, specifically packaging and maybe a couple of other things like generating of SBOM. And that builder, right, like based on the salsa spec, that should be fine as long as that builder itself is not under, like, can't be influenced by the build. As long as that builder can't be influenced by the build, and we have reasonable security controls around it, whether it's like, I think some of the discussions being brought up are, long term, sure, something like trusted execution environment, yada yada. But in short term, maybe something like a micro VM, something like Firecracker, something like Kata containers, something like, I don't know, like there's a bunch of different options out there. But anyway, wanted to get
I guess, what is the difference between like some of that, which is like the like Nitro Enclave and all that kind of stuff that AWS and stuff have?
So
and
Nitro Enclave,
lines?
yeah. So Nitro Enclave is similar to like the trusted execution environment, SGX, and some of these other things that AMD and Intel have. So that's the thing there, right? Is all of them are kind of, and this is like some of the conversations I've been having, is a lot of them are like the document, like there's not really abstract libraries for like, here's how you run in the trusted execution environment. It's like, oh, here's a 500-page spec doc. Read through how the hardware works and, learn what registers you need to be, like there's that sort of thing. And like, there's a couple of libraries that are at the low level that say, yeah, here's how to set stuff up, but it's not really like an abstract, here's how you run, a VM, right? That's where stuff like Project Oak, which is something that's being built out by Google, does. This is where some of the confidential container stuff comes in, and so on. And so I think like that sort of, and every time I've had the conversations with the confidential containers and some other folks, is like, it always feels like between 6 and 18 months off. And I think it is coming, just to be clear. But with that, comes a lot of other things, right? Like running in trusted execution environment is significantly slower than running outside. But for example, for most folks, I think for like, hey, here's like the core piece of my my business, I want to make sure it runs securely. I'm okay with, let's say, it taking twice as long to build, right? Because they were saying, like, I mean, it depends, but people were saying it's anywhere from 40% slower on, in sort of these sorts of use cases to, 4x slower. And depends, right? Like if you're talking about, hey, this build takes an hour, okay, 1 to 4 hours, a little ridiculous. Hey, if a build takes 5 minutes, 5 to 20 minutes, is still bad. But like if you're talking about, I ran this build in our CI system, cool, it's good. Let's do the official build, and then that takes 20 minutes. It's probably okay. And I'm sure that'll improve over time as well. But yeah, at least for right now, I think, and this is some of the conversations, had with Brendan as well, is like, does it make sense? Does it make a lot of sense just to kind of maybe take a step back and keep it simple and just sort of say, there's a lot of stuff from the perspective of Firecracker and other micro VMs and similar sorts of things. And just sort of like, I think the thing that people more, if we take a step back, I think the thing that folks are looking for is that abstraction. And yeah, the abstraction eventually one day could be, you know, it abstracts away the trusted execution environment and so on, but it could just also be for a short period of time, it abstracts away some controls and some like stuff around running in a container with no network access, right? Like, I think there's, that's at least the feeling I get. But anyway, I know I also cut off Sunny there.
No, it's all good. I would say for Fresca, I mean, you hit the point, and we talk about it multiple times, right? Is the adoption, and people need to get out of their CI. And I also feel like the more I work with like GitHub Action nowadays, like unless you're like a enterprise, your bank, you can't use GitHub. Like a lot of people get that checkbox checked already. Like there's not much of an incentive for them to, hey, I'm gonna build this system just to get to Salsa 3, for example. And then for the bank, I mean, you know how it is. It's, you never get them to get, you know, adoption in a short period of time for something like Fresca. And by the time they adopt it, maybe all the other CI system that they are using right now would have that capability. Yeah, that I mean, that's how I look at it. That it's difficult. But I do think that is a good kind of awareness type of project, like, and show people like the architecture and what are the things that they should be thinking about, and kind of get everything checked and thought out, like with their own build system, like for the enterprises. So
Yeah, that, you know, that makes sense to me. You know, yeah, I definitely like, personally, I've always, you know, I know you and I, Sunny, have always been like, moving off of a CI system is not as hard as people think. But the problem is, a lot of times, if we know this, right? If the way that people have built their CI systems didn't like weren't done, at least with some of the initial stuff done right in the first place, like if you've completely coupled your build into the CI system, you've done it wrong. But also, like, I recognize that makes it much harder to also move off. And I think a lot of folks have coupled a lot of the way that they're, you know, yeah, my artifact can only be built in something like a Jenkins because it relies on this Jenkins plugin specifically to run, and running it a different way is just not going to work. And you're like, okay, that's not a great idea, but okay, I get that.
yeah,
So that's,
and all the
yeah.
bureaucracy as well. I mean, you're talking about the, like, for some organization, you have an entire team like running that CI system for you, and you know, what do you expect them to kind of move off? What are they gonna do, right? For the security concern, I mean, it's, you know, for those executive, you know, in those organizations, I don't think the incentive is you know, strong enough to take those action. They could, but you know, it's gonna take ages and a lot of effort, and that needs to be a good.
Yeah, that, and then they won't move to Tecton. Also, Tecton is not the greatest.
Well, yeah, that's a separate thing.
But it's not just like a Jenkins plugin. It's that you've got all your authentication integrated into this thing. You've got a whole lot of business process, the different teams running it, all that stuff. It's a very sticky component within an infrastructure.
Yeah. And I think, you know, and I think it's one of the, it would not surprise me if making Jenkins more modular and componentized was not a priority for that, because hey, by making it easier to get off of, you know, I you know, because I think when it comes to a lot of this stuff, I know like there's a lot of great, you know, there's a lot of great plugins for Jenkins, but it all feels very much like based on, and to be clear here, I think also we've discussed this, like a lot of the stuff in Jenkins is, you know, not to I actually used to love Jenkins. It's just that, hey, after however many years, a lot of the architectural decisions they made during the Hudson era, you know, are still there today. And you know, that's why I think like for newer sorts of systems, I would recommend highly against folks using Jenkins. But you know, I know that sort of thing was also discussed like literally at Open Source Summit during the panel. Someone, you know, was like, hey, this Fresca thing, you're telling me I need to use Tecton chains, all these different components. Isn't there just like a GitHub action or like a Jenkins plugin? And I was like, well, okay, hold on, take a step back. You know, yes, like the idea here is not to say that Fresca is something that is easy to adopt and just for everybody. It is something that I think, you know, as time has gone on, we very much realized it's more of like a, you know, a representative example. And maybe the idea here is just making it easier for folks to sort of take a look at and do stuff. The other thing that folks had suggested at Open Source Summit is if we did want to push this, and OpenSSF seemed to be open to the idea of running Fresca as a component in the cloud, let's say, and start rebuilding, let's say, I don't know, Sigstore or whatever, using something like Fresca to sort of be like, hey, here is a Fresca that is built in a super secure, here's a, you know, a Sigstore, here's a Linux kernel, here's a whatever, built in a super secure environment. So that's one thing. The other thing was a lot of folks were just sort of saying, yep, can we just get a secure builder? I think, you know, one of the problems with even getting a Jenkins plugin for Salsa is you can get Jenkins 1 and probably Salsa 1 and probably Salsa 2 in Jenkins using a plugin. But once you get to Salsa 3, most likely not, because of all sorts of ways that like how Jenkins's internals work, making it very difficult to make the provenance something that is only being read in by the control plane, and you know, there's probably a bunch of stuff there. So I think that sort of thing is maybe something that we you know, I know it's something I'm looking at is this idea of, can we just create a secure build abstraction and right now fill it in with something like a container that is, you know, minimal with some security controls to ensure that, you know, hey, like the build piece itself is not network, like, you know, you can't use the network, and just sort of saying, yeah, it's not going to be for every single build. If you're, you know, if you're using an npm build that in the middle of the normal build, it reaches out to the internet to pull down, I don't know, graphics or something like that, sorry, that's not going to work. Please make that part of like the separate pull down source and dependency step, not part of the actual packaging step. Because a lot of folks I know, like the problem has been like they don't have a good way of splitting up source and dependencies, the build, and the packaging. Cool. Anything else? Any other thoughts? If folks were to say, like, just hypothetically, let's say we were to start moving in that direction of a secure builder, do folks think that that's something reasonable? Do folks think like, like there's enough secure build tools out there that we should just sort of adopt? Because I'm also like, if somebody can point me in the direction of something that is generic and extensible, I would like to use that. If folks are not familiar with something that's generic and extensible, it's something we can probably build.
I haven't gone digging for them, but I haven't seen one out there. So
Yeah,
maybe something
like,
like this already does this, but it's been on my list. It's been a long to-do list of mine to do, but I've got my ideas for how to do it. I know you got some different ideas for how you want to do it. And maybe it's a case of everybody throws something out and we see what spaghetti sticks on the wall.
yeah, I think there's that. And I think also for me, I think based on our conversations, it might make sense. And I don't want to get into the domain of over abstracting everything, but I do think that I do wonder if at some level there is something akin to the secure build abstraction interface, right? Or something like that, where the idea here is like, what are, or even just like, to take a step back, not talking about a 10-page white paper, but like if I were to write up like 2 pages of, if I'm a build, what are the things I'm most concerned with? And a lot of it is, I'm most concerned with pulling down source and dependencies in a way that is isolated and secure, like as in isolated, secure, and that whatever's doing that has been, what's the word, minimized, or sorry, I saw it had too much coffee this morning.
You're avoiding the word hermetic, and so I'm guessing you're
well,
trying
no,
to
no,
say
no,
you want to. I'm assuming you're trying to say you want to. If you pull from something as a content addressable store, you don't need to be hermetic because you know the digest of everything.
No. So actually, the thing I'm trying to say is, when constructing something that is hermetic, right? You want to say the build itself should be hermetic, like the actual packaging building step, right? That I think needs to be hermetic. The problem is, how do you make it hermetic, right? How do you give a build all of its source and dependencies? And there's a couple of different ways of,
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'd gone through some of that before, and yeah, one of the challenges when I started recording all the network traffic was, great, you recorded everything you did in one place, but now when you replay it somewhere else, how do you know that the thing you recorded in the first place was actually good and you didn't record a malicious build? Because then
Well,
you
yes.
malicious build, and that would be no good.
Yeah. So on that front, I'm a little less worried. Like I think as time goes on and we build more controls, and like this is where I think, once again, I think where Salsa came up with a really good idea, right, was separate out build security from what you're actually pulling in as source and dependencies, right? Because like, yes, source and dependencies means that the build could be potentially building something malicious, but at least you can, like, if you know that your build security is pretty good, you know that it wasn't like a SolarWinds of somebody compromised the build system and is now you know what I mean? Like, if you can start to isolate the different pieces and say, hey, we did a bunch of testing on the source, so we know it's not the source. We did a bunch of tests, we did a bunch of controls on the build, so we're pretty sure it's not the build. But the dependencies, we don't do a whole lot on. So let's really look at the dependencies. That seems to be the most likely culprit. That's not to say, obviously, right, like any of these things, right, state actors and all that, they'll find a way. But the idea here, at least making it much more expensive, and then also making it easier to know what's the thing I should be looking at when something does go wrong, I think is good. But like to kind of go back to the thing I had built when I worked at a hedge fund, was we didn't trust Kubernetes. And I know I've talked to most folks about this, right? We didn't trust Kubernetes. This is before Kubernetes had a lot of security features, and a lot of folks are still like, don't trust Kubernetes. And a lot of folks are still learning the container in and of itself is not a security boundary, yada, yada, yada. Since nothing else is going on, have you ever seen the that it's not really a vulnerability per se, it's just an issue with how Linux handles shell, and if you run a container via the shell, the container can send commands back up to the shell.
Is this standard output piping?
Pretty much. There's like a way that you can, when exiting from a container, and this is just like, we talk about like Linux namespaces and all that good stuff. So not running on a container runtime. So this is stuff like systemd and spawn and that kind of thing. If you, let's say, run that container via a shell, the problem is the output gets you can send output back as the exit. So you could pretty much say, like, I can't remember exactly how this worked, but you could essentially pipe the output of the container back to the original shell. So you just sort of return something like, cat Etsy shadow, pipe to something or whatever, and it would if you were running a shell, it would just do that. So you could go in like, and some folks had done that sort of stuff as ways of, because like if you were running the systemd nspawn containers as root and yada yada, you could do a whole bunch of stuff there. And it's not just systemd nspawn, but just anything that used just namespaces and that sort of thing. Because when you did, what's it like? What was it called? Like namespace enter or something like that, or nspace enter. There was some command.
NSenter.
NSenter. Yeah. If the container itself, if the namespace, whatever process was in there, returns something, it gets executed in the shell, which was really weird. And it was one of those things where they're just like, yeah, like based on the way all of this works in Linux, it's not fixable because it's just a key, But anyway, the way that we had built a lot of the stuff at the hedge fund was you had one container or one systemd nspawn container that downloaded source and dependencies. And to be clear, the source and dependencies were all content addressable through a nice little thing called nix. But I think that sort of thing is neither here nor there. We could do whatever. But it had a write only sort of file system that it would write everything to a like a mount, and then that container only had essentially Perl or whatever, right? It didn't have anything, it had a couple of tools to just download the source and dependencies. It had no binaries for GCC, glibc, nothing that could run the actual compilation. It was like it had like 3 minor things in there. I don't even think it had a shell in there. And that's all it could do. It would hand it off to the build. The build, right, because the build is running build tools, okay, it had a lot more build tools on there, but those build tools, but it did not have access to the network. And then we were also using eBPF style monitoring to say like, hey, make sure that even if it tries to make a syscall to the network, don't just deny it, record that, because I want to know that the build tool tried to reach out to the internet. We did some stuff there. We ran the build. It then wrote the output to a separate mount. And the other thing I should said, and I'll finish it and then I'll go back. And then the final thing it did was the third thing would go and publish the package. But the thing was, the first step, right? We had actually a trusted control plane where the trusted control plane was the output of the first thing got recorded and signed, and then uploaded to our Merkle tree. The second thing got built and signed, got uploaded to a Merkle tree. The third thing, the package actually got signed off by the actual packaging. Not the packaging, the upload sort of thing, and then got pushed out. And then that also got recorded. And if at any point the hashes didn't line up, you knew something was wrong. The Merkle tree wouldn't resolve correctly, and you knew like, hey, somebody built something, and yeah. Anyway, I'm not saying that sort of thing is something that is important for everybody, but I think like a simple thing that does that maybe is reasonable enough. I don't know if build packs can do that or something else like that can just sort of make that multi-step thing where, like, once again, the idea here being there's a trusted control plane being this build orchestration, right? But the build orchestration is super simple, right? That code can be audited. It's probably going to be, a couple of 100 lines at most, hopefully. At least like the high level code, the high level, code, not the libraries that the libraries call.
I don't want to know how many lines of code something like BuildKit is today. Depends on what you define as your orchestration layer and the build tooling itself. And yeah.
I think the secure builder would have to be more you know, it should be able to run in any kind of CI/CD system, though, right? Then, if it's Tecton or whatever you're trying to be using, I think that's how
Yeah.
we get adoption. Because if you make it again, be like, oh yeah, it only works here, then no one's going to use it again. So it has to be somehow be able to run in multiple different environments.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I think that the idea here would be, you know, like I think the thing that, oh, go ahead.
My own leaning is that maybe it would go toward like a rootless container environment, and you basically spin up inside of a container another container runtime doing whatever your build stuff is. So it's like isolation inside of whatever the CI isolation is. But that gets complicated really quickly.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that's kind of why I want us to, like, if we were to kind of go along with this, I would much rather focus on, or at least at the beginning, just sort of saying, what does a secure build generally look like? And like, you know, come up with some ideas. Cause like, once again, my idea, like that sort of 3-stage thing is one idea. There's other ones. And just kind of go through what some of that might look like at an abstraction layer and say, okay, great, this seems like the most extensible and easiest one to implement. And let's go. And then like we can actually look at the different potential implementations. Cause yeah, I was also looking at, you know, running nested containers, right? You know, because I think folks are going to want that more than they're going to want Jenkins calls out to some other service which runs that particular build. Like it's, you know, one might be a little easier to implement, but is like folks are just like, yeah, but I don't want to run that. I want to just run a container.
If you spin up a self-contained secure builder within some CI platform, the CI platform itself is going to probably be running your workload as a container itself, more than likely.
Yeah.
Thinking through the salsa requirements, are we still required from whatever the secure builder is to spin up our workloads internally inside of containers? And so nested containers are required because of salsa levels. I mean, salsa says everything has to be isolated.
Yes. So there's a couple of things there, right? So the isolated and ephemeral requirements coming from salsa is largely just different builds can't affect each other in time or space, right? You know, like they can't, you know, 2 concurrent builds can't, you know, affect each other's resources and yada. And then, you know, which is the thing that.
But then thinking of like the networking stack, you probably want that different than the secure build environment that's running that build itself, right? You don't want your workload that you're building to be on the exact same network as your secure builder that's supposed to be highly privileged. So you're almost forced to go into a nested container scenario.
So you're talking about like the actual isolated build itself? Or
yeah,
which
thinking
piece?
that, you know, I'd have to go look through all the requirements again, but I'm just kind of thinking through them and just, I'm trying to go through the scenario in my head of saying, are we forced down the path that if you built a secure builder that could run in a CI environment, are we forced into a nested container scenario? Or is there some kind of design that could be set up where you're still salsa compliant and running everything in there, just like a Java build or something else, and there's output in a JRE? Is there a scenario where you don't have to go nested container?
So like if we were to take a step back, like the salsa requirement is that what they're just calling, and to be clear, I think it's actually pretty reasonable because it allows a lot of flexibility. The problem is the flexibility, I think, leads up to a lot of folks to just be like, great, I could do something that follows the letter of the law, but maybe not the spirit of the law, which is stuff that I'm dealing with a lot. But the thing is, they call it the trusted control plane, or, you know, the trusted build control plane. And the idea here is just, can you, if you were to call that nested container the trusted control plane, great. If you were to call something else the trusted control plane, but the properties of the trusted control plane are pretty much, the trusted control plane is the thing that orchestrates the builds and makes sure that the builds are isolated from each other. So if that parent container is, if that top level container is the trusted control plane, it itself is gets spun up, and you're doing the right things from, let's say, a security perspective to make sure that every time you spit, because this is also another thing that Salsa can't handle right now, is a lot of folks would argue, well, every time you spin up that new container, that's a new trusted control plane that requires a new attestation that it is Salsa compliant. You know what I mean? Like it's now a new hosted builder every single time that container spins up, which, just to be clear, I'm trying to, for like something like a Salsa 1.1, to get them to sort of clarify some of those things so that folks recognize that the software itself and can hit, let's say, some of the Salsa conformance without the runtime piece. And then you could say the runtime of the, control plane, here is like that attestation, that's because it's being run by, let's say my secure Jenkins or whatever, because you still obviously want to have, you're still going to need to have at some level, if you're, let's say, running it through Jenkins, if Jenkins has access to the underlying resources, Jenkins will have access to, at some level, mess with whatever's happening, which is also why something like the nested container stuff, I think that if you do the right things from like Jenkins even doesn't have root access necessarily on some of the resources, you might be okay. I don't know. But anyway, I think the nested container thing is something to look at. I think the other option, right, and this is the thing I was saying before, is, and it's less ideal because people are not going to want to run a persistent thing that just runs orchestrated builds. But you could have a very thin API, right, that just all it does is it listens to these things and then runs those things in the isolated network in the super contained thing. That obviously comes with, like, now you've taken something that's just like a couple of containers and now you've said, no, now it's its whole API, it's its whole thing.
It doesn't scare me as much as it might scare you, though, because when I think about what happens in a regular container build, there's a it's already client server based today.
Well, yes, sorry. It's not about the client.
There's already a client running that packages up all of the context, the build context, ships it off to the container server to build it. It takes the whole context and everything else, does its whole build and spits back, okay, here's your container image. So it's already built into the architecture, a lot of what's going on. You'd just be potentially hijacking some of that to say, hey, instead of sending your context off to the Docker engine to build, send it off to the secure build engine to build.
Yeah, so this is actually something that I've been trying to also read up on, and some folks might know more than, probably know more than me, and is I was looking at, because with Containerd, you could have plugins that are supposed to help with potentially this sort of scenario. Like, that's why I was looking at, like, you can, the Kata containers, right? There is like a Kata plugin for some of these things. The problem is I've never been able to get any of them to work right. Partially because I believe a lot of the stuff like Kata containers just do not work on Mac, right? Like, even if you had like Lima and Colima, they're like, no, we are expecting certain key things at the x86 64 level, not at the, ARM, kind of architecture level.
Should we talk about running your own Linux distribution? Now I'm just trolling you. I'm seeing how long you're going to go without saying Nix.
Yeah, no. Just to be clear, I've actually been joking with some folks about, nowadays with how things have been going, everybody has a Nix everybody has a Linux distribution. But I do think it's worth exploring more. I do wonder. It sounds to me, and once again, I don't want to take this meeting up, like, I'd much rather just sort of say, well, no, I know I'm willing to take this literal time right now. But I mean, if we were to kind of go back, I would much rather, let's say, get a group of 5 or 6 like-minded individuals and sit down and just like sketch out what this thing might look like. If folks were like interested, right? Like if folks were not interested, I could go and just sort of hack on it myself and do it. But I would like, 5 or 6 folks who are hands-on keyboard sorts of folks who can kind of come in and say, hey, here's the thing that we looked at, here's what we think needs to happen. And then maybe try to pull in, like I spoke to the Project Oak folks a couple of weeks ago. They seem very interested in this use case. The problem is, with what they're trying to do, they're very much like, no, we're 100% secure. We're doing everything in the trusted execution environment. The problem is getting a Linux kernel running in the trusted execution environment is very non-trivial. But they're doing actually a lot of cool stuff where and this is something that I think we should also consider just from the conceptual level. They're doing this thing of like very minimal BIOS, very minimal firmware, very minimal like bootloader, very minimal kernel, and then those things begin to load. Like they're like, we're willing to take the performance cost of like running lots of things that just sort of call each other and each one has a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more in exchange for like ridiculous amounts of security. And so they have something they call like the stage 0 bootloader or something like that, which is like hyper minimal. And like some of these things like can't even call like a, I can't remember, it's like, some of these are like ring -5 or whatever it is. It's like some of these things, like the way that they work, it can only run like at very, very, very specific areas. But like a lot of this stuff, it's like it can't call directly into a Linux kernel and load a Linux kernel. It's like because there's just not enough there. So you have to do all this different stuff, and then it can go in and load the Linux kernel like once it's done a whole bunch of stuff. And it sounded like that sort of stuff was months to maybe a year or 2 away. But I still like that idea of if we think about it and say, hey, what are we trying to do? Well, as much as we can, we want to sort of make it so this is not a generic, like the key thing here. And I think it's like if I were to, and I'm going to just start writing up some stuff in a Google Doc and then share it with folks here and probably share it with some other folks, and to be clear, like from the 5 or 6 people who we're going to bring in, we get to decide, and not like somebody come in from the outside and be like, yeah, but have you thought about this use case that's not within the scope of what we originally thought of? Like, no, sorry. The thing I wanted to bring up was I do think we want to state like some key principles, the key principles being this is not a generic workload orchestrator. That is like very key here, right? Like maybe if you squint, oh, sure, it could probably run things other than secure builds. I don't care. The intention here, it is going to be keyed into running secure builds. That's it. And running secure builds that can be SALSA compliant, and I think a few other things like can it generate, is there anything in there that would make it impossible to generate an SBOM, right? I doubt it, but I think there's a handful of things like that, and that we just want to define, and then we just say, great, what are the things that we need to do that? Anyway, I've been ranting for a while. Sorry.
Makes sense. On my own schedule, probably 3 months from now, give or take, is when I'm probably going to start looking at this stuff again.
Cool. Yeah.
In a more serious nature, rather than just like the casual chat, but actually hands-on keyboard writing some code.
Yeah. For us right now, I think Guac is most of us at Kusari and whatnot are still very, very focused on Guac. But we're hoping in the coming months, once that begins to blow up a little bit more and we get more contributors and maintainers to Guac, we'll have more time to focus on stuff like secure build. Because a lot of folks are still like, hey, Fresca itself maybe was not the thing, but a lot of folks are still asking for open source summit, right? A ton of folks were like, okay, cool, but I don't want to use SAS. Great, so they don't want to use the GitHub stuff. Is there something else that is as simple as the GitHub stuff? And I like that, the idea of that reusable workflow that they have. And I also think that there's areas where whatever this builder could be that like mythical, salsa 4+ kind of thing where it is hermetic, it is, reproducible once we bring that back in. And one of the things I need to, because I just saw some stuff come up, the thing I need to fight against is people are asking to convert salsa into Git submodules and start to move the different pieces of salsa, because like the salsa website and the salsa spec are all in the same spot and yada yada. And the problem that I'm gonna have, and the problem that I'm having is I am yet to work at a place that has ever used submodules correctly. I've never, or a project, right?
I was very confused there for a second because when you first said, I was assuming that it was salsa applied to some
No.
project becoming submodules or something like that, and I was not following it all until I realized no, you're talking about salsa itself. They're just trying to split up
Yeah.
the repos of salsa.
And I would be, if folks are familiar with submodules, please provide your input on this PR. I've only used submodules in a couple of ways. I just really, maybe it's just me who's had been traumatized by submodules in the past.
They can be a bit of a pain. It depends on how you use them.
Yeah.
I try to get away from them when I can.
Yes.
But it might just be that there's too much in one repo. It needs to be broken up somehow logically, and you don't need a submodule. It's just two different repos. I'd have to look at this specifically though.
Yeah. I know actually in a very previous life, and they might have fixed this, but we had a spiraling submodule problem. I don't know if you've ever seen this. Of you have a Git submodule that calls a Git submodule that calls a Git submodule that calls the first Git submodule, but an older version of the Git submodule.
No.
And so you end up in this situation that like things just begin to call older and older versions of the thing. And I remember like I was just like looking at this going, like each of these things is maybe a total of 30,000 lines of code. But when I actually pull down all the submodules, it's like 15 gigs. What the heck is going on here? And it was like, it just kept recursively calling it, like, and it kept going back and back in time. And it also led to all sorts of other issues, right? Because like, we were using it for stuff like Ansible and Chef. So we had like, we were like, wait a second, why are we using the Chef thing? Like we fixed that bug. What's going on? And we found out that like, no, you don't understand. Like this like Chef cookbook or module or whatever Chef module called this older Chef module, which called an older version of the first submodule, which had the bug in it. And you're like, anyway, and maybe people can use it correctly, but have
they
anyway.
considered in this vendoring instead of a Git submodule?
That's probably where I'm going to push it. I just took a cursory glance and I went, this seems weird. Like, why would we not just sort of say, here's a release of a thing and then pull that release of like the content as opposed to, putting it all in one spot.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm just going to take a look and, like the idea here, I'm going to take a look at it. I know it's completely unrelated to Fresca, but it like looking at the submodule, right? The idea behind a Git submodule is you also want to pull down the history of that thing that you're pulling in, right? It is like you are pulling in a separate Git tree and you're sort of conceptually saying my Git tree has this pointer to this other Git tree, right? And so if we're just saying pulling in the content, why are we not just vendoring that content and saying, but anyway, I'll take a closer look here.
Is it because they like it? Again, I could be wrong, but is it because like, oh, if there's some subs, oh, I could do the same thing with vendoring, I guess. Use updates if it ever goes to a different version and just download the new stuff.
Well, I mean, I get where so some of it is because the website is the canonical representation of the salsa spec, which is a problem for a few different reasons. And it's the same thing that we're obviously dealing with the SPDX3 stuff. We're trying to push, like, you want to update the website so people can see like the draft immediately. At the same time, like a release of 1.0 is probably the thing where you can vendor that. But when you're like when everybody's making a minor update here and there, it's a little bit harder because you just want to be able to like, hey, I want to pull whatever's on main. Though I'm pretty sure you could probably just do that as part of the build as opposed to doing the Git submodules. You could just say, and I think the thing too is they're trying to avoid the thing of people having to pull down, like when I do a Git clone, they just want to pull down multiple repos at the same time. While also still being able to kind of, I don't know. I'm gonna have to read up on this a little bit more. It feels like it feels like a whole lot of stuff to fix a very simple problem that, yeah, anyway. So anyway, I know, Brendan, you said, you'll look at this much more detail in 3 months, but is it all right if, like, let's say a handful of us started poking around with stuff on a Google Doc and just sort of shared it with you and can get your feedback?
Yeah, I mean, I'll look and chat. I'm just not going to write anything for a little bit here.
Yep, no problem. Cool. If there's anything else, say it now. Otherwise, we can end it.
When you say end it, is this the official ending? We're going to go into the calendar and pull this off for all future meetings.
Yep. At least for now. I'm just gonna say, hey, look, it's not really worth the folks' time because we've been having the same 5 conversations. And it's not to say that we're suspending it, but we're gonna reevaluate and bring it back maybe in the future.
I would just say the meeting isn't needed.
Yes.
The project is still going to continue async.
Yep.
I think that's something OpenSSF doesn't do well, which is to bring a project on and just say, look, the project can do its thing. They don't need a meeting to have the project.
Yep. And to be clear here,
you actually need to meet.
Yeah, it was funny because when we first started the meeting, it took me like a month and a half to get OpenSSF to actually correctly create the meeting, and it should be fun. It'll be funny if they push back against like canceling the meeting. But yeah, so I mean, with some of that said, like, a bunch of the folks at OpenSSF, like David Wheeler and Jonathan Lysich, have all sort of expressed interest in helping with something like Fresca. I think they've all sort of said, hey, look, and this is something I can push asynchronously, I just don't have a ton of time, is running something like, SigStore or whatever inside of Fresca to build it, to show it could be Salsa level 3 and yada. But we'd also need, I think, a handful of extra hands-on keyboard here. And I know, as we can see, a bunch of the other maintainers of Fresca, are unable to actually join and, on a regular basis and yada. So, Anyway, that's about it. Cool. Well, I'll talk to you all later.
Awesome.
Cheers.